I love it when the various options in a game feel about equally powerful because I like trying lots of different things, and I usually hate it when I have to unlock those different options because I like to try lots of different things. I want to play with the different options available, not for the different options available. But how about this? If I like a part of a game, a certain playstyle, and I can unlock stuff in the order of my choosing, which I can in many cases. In God of Weapons, I can. And I choose to unlock things that benefit that playstyle I like. Aren't I kind of able to rebalance the game to my liking? Whatever I like will come to feel reasonably powerful that way, you'd think. If there's something I'm enjoying and it doesn't feel strong enough yet, can't I just focus on playing it more and then it will become powerful? Anything will be able to become powerful? In other words, despite the fact that I dislike them, it kind of seems like these unlock systems line up with my desire for equal feeling power. Well, hi, I'm Xandy. Let's do a video about that. I'm using God of Weapons as an example here, because this is a game that I have started only recently. I don't have everything unlocked yet. That's important because in these games, well, you often can't unlock things. And God of Weapons doesn't have a method by which you control which items are in the pool. There does appear to be some kind of system where when an item has been selected in a run, if you buy a certain type of weapon, for example, the game will show you more of that weapon. So the loot pool is, you could say, weighted, maybe, a little bit, but I still think it's a significant issue, and you can't kind of easily simulate a state of affairs where you've unlocked these things but not those things. Like, I'm not going to be able to demonstrate that to you. But I'd just like to highlight that this video really isn't intended to prove anything. We will be talking about how no one knows all builds later, but this is just an example so we can discuss the topic. So the little experiment or demonstration we're going to do is pretty simple. I early on got interested in the Hunter class. It's, a basic ranged weapon focused archetype. And part of the reason I was interested in the Hunter is because it kind of seemed like it wouldn't scale that well. Having longer range, being able to attack the enemies from further away, well, it seemed to me like surely if that does good damage up to higher levels, it's literally just better in every way. You stay safer, but you also do good enough damage. That seemed surely overpowered. And so let's find out, does it feel like it's properly balanced later? I'm not entirely sure. Here's an early stage I was in a run as the Hunter. You can see I just have a bunch of random range weapons, and this was one of my first times playing this class. And we're just going to see how it goes and talk about, what it means to have unlockable goals like that, how they shaped my experience, whether that was good in some ways, bad in other ways, why I dislike it so much. You get the idea. So you're zooming through playing a class you like, and you have some goal for something you want to unlock. An item for the item pool that seems like it would be good with that class, or maybe a starting item for that particular archetype, or whatever it is, a new version of that class. I think a positive thing is pretty straightforward. It's that it feels like you have a specific goal made for your individual tastes. You can play and progress the game in a way that is built around what you like. And a negative aspect, to me anyway, is that I feel like I'm encouraged to do a run that's a little too easy just to unlock a thing that is good for the build I want to play before doing the actual run where I have the thing that I know will be really good. Let me explain that in a little more detail. So let's say I pick the sharpshooter archetype here, and you can see it gives you damage based on your range, and you start with some extra range. Piercing through enemies is a little weaker just to balance having really long range. You can see if I look at starting items that I've got this unlocked, and it gives attack speed, pretty straightforward ranged buff. This one, which wants you to mix melee and ranged weapons, there's a Hunter archetype like that. And then this one, which I haven't unlocked, and it doesn't say what it does, but it says have 3 pierce as the sharpshooter. So presumably, this one is like the sharpshooter themed starting item. I can still play the class and enjoy it. This is 30% attack speed for nearby weapons. That's just good. That's fine. But I may really want this. The way I would enjoy playing the sharpshooter may revolve around this. Now, at the moment, I don't have that many items unlocked that give me pierce. So what I'm incentivized to do is to play on low difficulty and just re-roll over and over again really aggressively for the items that give me pierce. Probably, normally, I wouldn't want to stack 3 pierce as the sharpshooter, at least not at the expense of all else. But to unlock this, I do need to do that. And so you could view these as just, oh, well, you play. Now and again, you'll do one of the challenges, you'll unlock the thing, and then you can enjoy it. But personally, I think that it both encourages you to play in a way that is generally less advantageous and highly benefits you playing at a difficulty probably not that stimulating for you, so that you don't have to be frustrated by failing to unlock the thing that you want. Now, there is a lot to unpack there. Again, some players might simply not feel that same pressure. You might feel like, well, I'll just play normally and I'll get the Pierce when I want it. Pierce is good. I've got one Pierce here without particularly aiming to unlock that item. It's not like it's bad, and so when it happens, no big deal. You might feel that way. This is definitely, to some extent, a playstyle thing. If you just do focus on getting the stuff that might be good for your build more, this might bother you more than it otherwise would. Sure, but it's not as if nobody besides me is bothered by things like that. It's also worth noting that this has somewhat to do with your understanding of different marginal benefit or different multipliers in your build. This idea that if you have a lot of a thing, it's advantageous to get more of something else, rather than just stacking more and more of that one thing. Once you can pierce enemies at all, it becomes less valuable to be able to pierce them more and more, because it's less likely there'll be that many enemies in a line, and more valuable to do more damage. You're doing more piercing to each enemy. You could think about it as a multiplier too. Now that you pierce 3 enemies, damage boosts are triple the effectiveness if you hit 3 enemies with them. And so getting more pierce versus just getting more damage is less appealing now. Not every player thinks of it that way. It's true for every player, but if that math doesn't make sense to people, they may play in a way where it seems like no disadvantage to stack up one stat really high, even though, again, I hate to be argumentative when I say it is a disadvantage to do that. This is a problem that could go away if you don't feel the presence of that as strongly. That's not bad. I'm making my own problem, if you want to say it that way, but there is something there. It's not just me making up something I'm annoyed by. Now, I'm really going on about how I dislike these unlock systems in games, and I wanted to say that I'm aware that lots of people do like these kinds of directed challenges. They might feel like they provide secondary goals for your runs, for example. I generally dislike them, I was explaining before, because I feel like they ask me to do things I don't want to do right now in order to try a new option I want to try right now. Or maybe I'll work to unlock something and then find out it isn't all that. I just feel like they're unlocking key features for parts of the game I already want to play. I don't need an incentive to play that. So if you did want an incentive to play that part of the game, great. But if you don't want an incentive to play that part of the game, or you already have one, you just want to, I feel they kind of interrupt that enjoyment a little bit. To me, it's just worse than being able to try a variety of options. I just want to do that from the start. I don't need any invitation. But again, I'd imagine that players that like these kinds of challenges, well, they like them because they provide some goals. That's great in theory. I don't begrudge other people for not immediately having goals. It's a game. This is my job. Of course, I have things I want to try right off the bat, and that's not going to be everyone. Though it's not also as if nobody else feels this way that I do either. I would like to figure out a way to get that benefit, those potential goals for some players, without also pissing off people like myself. So alright, in our example, I was interested in how the Hunter class may or may not scale, and I wanted to unlock other stuff to see how that felt. I just had the Hunter from the default, and I was using a bunch of range weapons, and it was going fine. I often had trouble with larger swarms of enemies, because while I could hit them from far away, I didn't hit for that much damage. I didn't feel like I was able to lean into the strengths of hitting enemies from far away, like I would be able to if I had greater range. Anyway, we'll come back to that, though I'm not burying the lead very much, am I? And basically, I think the test for these unlock systems, to some extent, is whether or not I have more fun after the unlock than before it. To some extent, you could look at this and say, well, it might not feel good to need to unlock the thing, but you're just being impatient. It will feel nice once you've unlocked it. You'll feel that sense of achievement. They've got to take it away from you, but then once you have it, you'll enjoy it. And unbeknownst to you, you might be saying to yourself, well, Xandy, you would enjoy it less if you had it from the start. You might not want to have it withheld from you, but if you did really get it right from the start, you wouldn't be as happy otherwise. Well, I don't know about that. Let's get into it a little. I think that's a reasonable thing to wonder. I don't know. Sure, we can't go back in time and see how it is. I will just note in my example before that my interest in how the hunter may or may not scale, I mean, the sharpshooter class quite directly addresses that concern. You get a lot of range. It kind of penalizes Pierce a little bit, but that's because it's going to be pretty strong in all likelihood. And it gives you a damage scaling resource for range, which is a very powerful stat in general. Another thing about Sharpshooter is you're allowed to use melee weapons, and range affects melee weapons. Because you get so much range, you can use melee weapons at significant range, and this means that you aren't limited to those lesser scaling ranged weapons while getting a lot of range and, you know, maybe stacking a bunch of range damage. So did I have more fun after I unlocked this subclass? You know, was I happier now that I had this? I was. I started enjoying playing the hunter a lot more. I started some sharpshooter runs. So let's break down what's happening here. I mean, there's a positive to unlocking the sharpshooter now because I played the hunter first, you know, not knowing the sharpshooter existed or what exactly that class did, though I could have looked it up. I had this experience where I thought, well, for this to be better, for ranged attacking like this to be better, I would want, you know, X, Y, or Z. In my case, I was thinking, well, I want some way to scale damage with a different stat. And what do you know? I unlocked a subclass that lets you scale damage with ranged weapons and melee weapons with a different stat. So there's a positive there, I suppose. You can focus on unlocking stuff for classes which you think are underpowered, but which you like, and you wouldn't have had as much of a sense of what could improve them until you play them. You know, maybe they'll turn out to be really strong, but until you know one way or the other, your experience will be, this sounds cool, and I'll play it a little bit and learn what it could benefit from. Then you unlock those things, and it feels personal, maybe. Now, I would argue it would still be better if things just were balanced. I mean, I don't think it would be worse if the hunter was good, already very good, and maybe you consider the hunter to be good if you play God of Weapons, but my point is, it wouldn't be worse if the hunter was good and the sharpshooter is just a new way to do well, rather than the version where you unlock a thing that makes the not good class good. You see what I mean? It's not necessarily of merit that you change the thing from being bad to good. I personally think it would still be better if, in theory, there was something good you could do with each of the classes. And I really think there's a detriment hidden in there as well. When the balance feels less concrete, like when the game is about you enabling or unlocking the things that make a class or a various playstyle feel valuable or viable at all, you kind of get this sort of second guessing feeling, like how much of it is that you're bad versus my build is a bad idea. I can't experience the level of success my build might have been getting because I don't really know whether the class I've taken is going to succeed with that strategy. You can't really blame it on yourself or the build. You don't really know. It's possible that the build is intended to be really weak until you unlock something that makes it feel powerful, or it's possible that's not the case. In God of Weapons, I've gotten to thinking that unfortunately it is significantly differently the case or not for different characters. These characters are not particularly well balanced with each other, and so for some of them, if your build isn't doing well, I would say you can do some game design detective work to figure out that that is you. The character is pretty strong and you just have to get items that enable that. And for others, I mean, I don't know. No one knows all builds. Maybe there's a way to scale the hunter class really well, and I just haven't experienced it. But it's less clear to me that that class just is really powerful. They're just not really made very equal. And so your ability to think about what you've made and whether it did well, your ability to get feedback from your build experience on whether or not you did a good job, your creation ended up being cool or getting there or not, is kind of broken. Like I sort of can't draw that distinction as easily. Because of the unlocks, there really is no complete form of the game's balance. And an important point I want to make in this video is that it's almost impossible to actually know if things are mostly equal in power. In almost any game, like nobody knows all builds just because I've spent some time having a certain experience, and I haven't spent that much time with God of Weapons. In no way am I trying to say I know for sure this is that way. But really no one can say that. You can really never know for sure that there is somehow no way to make a thing work really well. And you'll see this in games communities. Players will frequently contradict each other and say that's terrible, there's no way that's any good. And right in the same thread on Reddit or whatever, somebody will say, oh, I do great with that all the time. Like, I'm sure both people have had those experiences, but there's something going on there. And it's usually that no one knows all builds. You can't possibly have just had every single possible experience. And it can feel like if you have a lot of time and experience with something that you have been very thorough, but there's just not really a way to do that most of the time. Having said that, we can still go beyond just saying it feels fairly even or uneven. God of Weapons does have a lot of ways it could change the power level of its various weapons, the size and shape of the weapons in the item box, their range, the number they take to merge to a higher tier, the tags on the weapons, not to mention plenty of stats like range and crit stats. And you can see how they're hitting enemies, like things that aren't mentioned as clearly, like the hitbox of the attack, or the way it bounces, the range in which it bounces, stuff like that. There certainly are a lot of ways that things could be made to be different but relatively equal in theory. And I mean, when you look at the classes, you can see the knight here, for example, says Weapon Master. You pick different weapons and you get more attack speed for each unique weapon, no ranged weapons. Or you mix melee and magic power and you get more armor. You get a ton of armor and then you get melee and magic power for those types of weapons. So surely if you pick an archetype like this that basically calls out, do this, put a bunch of unique weapons in your inventory, do this, stack a bunch of armor and use melee and magic weapons. Surely you could check those. No one knows all builds, but surely you can come up with a build that is pretty much doing the thing this says to do, right? And if you do that and you stack all those kinds of weapons that the archetype tells you to stack, while you can't possibly know for sure if you found like one of the types of builds or build approaches that would be good, it sure does say something if that approach to making a build is bad. If you do the thing that the build says to do, these are pretty simple archetypes anyway, and it doesn't work at all, I mean, surely you're not so far off base. It's actually secretly amazing if you do something very convoluted. And I mean, if you can't achieve relatively equal power to other strategies without doing something really convoluted, which also means it's less likely you'll get those items in your run, I think that counts as those things not having relatively equal power. Just because they could, in theory, somehow, some way, with the perfect combination of items, achieve relatively equal power doesn't mean that those things are well calibrated against each other, right? Like it's got to be within the realm of possibility to get those amounts of damage. Now, just a simple example with the Eldritch Knight here, there are so many armor items, like it's so easy to turn this archetype on. Fact aside how well it scales, and I thought it scaled very well and was really, really overpowered, but it's so easy to get the stuff that makes this good. There's so many items that enable this strategy so readily available. I don't know. So nobody knows all builds, but that's a good start. If building around certain classes like that feels wildly unequal, it's possible an individual player is just terrible at the type of, movement one playstyle wants you to use or something. And then potentially fairly equal playstyles could feel very unequal to certain players, of course. But mostly, you might reasonably assume that we know at least more of the possible good builds with these archetypes, like ranged weapons, fist weapons. So yeah, if they feel very unequal, that's not a good sign. In such a way, we may conclude that a game's given options aren't created very equal. But remember that the idea is that perhaps it just doesn't matter. Does unlocking stuff help address that situation? So that whatever playstyles you enjoy, you will hopefully be able to adjust them to be fun for you. Basically here, I want to walk through why I think it might appear to be a good experience for some people, this feeling like you can unlock things to upgrade a certain playstyle to feel more powerful. If you only focus on one type of build at a time, like let's say I'm only in the realm of playing the Hunter from before, unlocking things for that archetype does let you progress power, and then I guess if you swap to another archetype, you'll feel like your power has reset somewhat. So it will feel like you started scaling, the Hunter, and they got to a good point, they were bad, they became good, and then you switch to another class or archetype, and then they feel, weak again, like what you remember the Hunter originally feeling like. So then you get these nice little power progressions throughout the game. But I think something important happens when you switch over like that. The experience you've built up playing the previous archetype, looking for those items moving in such a way, whatever it is, and the items and unlocks you got for that archetype, those things both obviously go away to some extent when you play something else. And my thinking is that jump down in how strong you feel will cover up all but the most wildly unequal archetypes in a game, and everything may feel fine. You might feel your experience on average will be that, oh, I'm less powerful just like before, not remembering the exact level of power that you had previously. And you might be saying, well, what's the problem then? It sounds like the illusion, though an illusion it is, works, and it maintains that feeling like things start off weak and then become strong as you progress them. What's the problem, right? Well, all of that goes out the window if you don't play through each option one at a time. If you use the availability of all of the different character classes, if there's any point to having the option to play like a different character class to get variety or whatever, well, I personally find it pretty easy to notice rather large differences in power between the various options I have like that. And with that point of comparison, my difficulties with the given archetype do feel cheapened. Like, I know it's mostly going worse because it wasn't given the various tools to succeed that other archetypes were. I end up finding out quite quickly that the curtain is pulled back. This archetype is just weak compared to other ones. It doesn't really have anything to do with my build, because I'm not seeing the power progression for each individual archetype in isolation. I'm trying different archetypes. But you see my point, right? You can imagine a player playing in a way where they wouldn't notice that, even though it is quite clearly true in the game, or they would experience that if they did play, a great variety of different archetypes, they switched it up a lot. You can imagine a player experiencing a game where someone like me insists that there isn't any semblance of equality between the various options, and yet they would feel like, no, they were totally balanced. It felt completely reasonable to pick between different options, and neither person's experience is really wrong, and yet there is something sort of problematic about the state of the game. I would also like to add that you can imagine how this difficulty in perceiving balance would extend to playtesting. So it's not just that the game, it could just be balanced though. Well, it might be hard for playtesters to figure out how powerful certain options are if this experience takes hold. I mean, I suppose you could force your playtesters to play things in a certain order. I value relatively equal power highly. And as I said at the start of the video, I'm kind of really sick of hearing people repeat the same old thing about how it doesn't matter in player versus environment games. It's common to hear people say balance doesn't matter in PvE games, in games that are not player versus player PvP. But our little test did change my feelings a bit in that sense. The ultimate goal is, of course, fun. And while I insist that it's still bad that things aren't like all that equal power-wise, that still affects players, even if they don't consciously experience it. Like, there is still inequality in the power between the various options, and that might make the player have less fun, even if they don't know it's happening. Sure, it isn't a problem for a lot of people. I can easily see it being covered up, and if you don't notice, it arguably isn't much of an issue. To some extent, I think it's fair to say that I complain about players complaining about balance being irrelevant more than that actually happens. Like, I haven't heard people say that too much recently. Sometimes it'll be someone coming into a stream for the first time and we'll be talking about, relatively equal power balance or whatever, and they'll say, oh, that doesn't matter in PvE games. And then pretty quickly we'll just say our bid and it's fine. So I don't mean to make a fuss about nothing. It's good to keep these things in context. It's not the end of the world if the game doesn't have perfectly equal power among all of its options. This video could be seen as a demonstration or a discussion of how it is surprisingly irrelevant if the things in the game have not well calibrated power compared to each other. But I do still think it has an effect on the game's fun, and I wonder if a lot of people like me who are bothered by this kind of thing just don't have a way to put it to words, or it's harder to break it down, or you hear people saying, well, it's not a problem for me, and so why are you making a fuss about it? This quashes a lot of potentially good discussions, so I still thought this video was worth making, worth discussing. In God of Weapons, you don't explicitly need to vary the archetypes that you play, but in a game where there's more of a push from the game to play, different characters and such, maybe you have to, or there's more of a reward for doing so, you can imagine this kind of thing would be more of a problem because you're going to notice, even if you aren't the type of player to normally switch things up a lot, the game is asking you to, so you're gonna notice that lack of equality in power. Some archetypes are gonna feel a lot weaker, even to players that otherwise wouldn't have noticed if you hadn't force them to play a variety of archetypes. And again, I would still argue, the whole point of having the different options is that you play them. It's good if they're relatively equal in power. That makes the game more fun. For God of Weapons, I think the final piece of the puzzle would be to let you remove items from the pool. You could make an item pool very focused for a specific character, but that's truly a different topic for another time. Folks, I've been Xandy, and that's the video. Let's see where we're off to next.